species, that doesn't mean that different species can't hybridize, right? So a good example would be humans and Neanderthals, right? So we were two different species, but we were still capable of hybridizing, such that humans still carry the remains of Neanderthal DNA at approximately about a 4% rate in our current DNA. So just because you develop different species doesn't mean hybridization is impossible, right? So, like I said, take everything with a little grain of salt when we talk about the production of completely different species. Once you are somewhat related, sometimes there's a little bit of bleed between one group and another group. Certainly. Some different organisms are not going to be able to breed together, so you can't take like a seahorse and a human and breed them together. But if you're close enough evolutionarily related, there is some wiggle room sometimes. All right. So that said, what we're going to be using as an example today is an organism known as the maggot fly. So maggot fly is a good case study for speciation, and we'll try to identify why that's the case as we go through here. All right, so this is our buddy, the maggot fly, and one aspect of the body plan or the characteristics of the maggot fly that I want to point out here has to do with the pattern that you see on the wings. And so this is another principle of evolutionary change that I'm not necessarily going to talk about, but I think it's worth bringing up here. If you step back from a fly, you'll notice that the pattern on the wings makes it look like the pincers of let's say a different arthropod type of organism. All right, so that's a defensive evolutionary change that would indicate to predators that perhaps this is not a fly that could be easily eaten, but is in fact a different type of arthropod that can defend itself. So that's the idea of evolutionary mimicry, right? So that falls into the same category as camouflage. The way that you can either pretend that you're something that you're not, the way that you could blend in with your environment to prevent against being seen, like we saw with the peppered moth. So these are different types of evolutionary changes that unfold that's worth pointing out here because you could see it so readily, but we're not necessarily going to focus in on that as one of the features of the maggot fly. Okay, what we are going to talk about is speciation. And to begin the story, what you need to be able to understand is where you find the maggot fly naturally. Probably over thousands of years, they have identified a habitat and began to use that habitat. And the habitat in question is a type of shrub known as a hawthorn shrub. And that shrub produces fruit that is going to be utilized by the fly. Not the adult fly, but instead by the maggots, the larval form of the fly. All right, so you already now are taking an organism, you're tying it to a habitat. All right, so how does this unfold?
Professor, can you go back for a second?
I mean, you don't necessarily need all the details about this. This is just kind of like conceptually looking at how, using an example, how some of the principles that you learned about can impact organisms. All right, so how do these two things work together, right? The fruit and the fly. So females, as they go through their breeding cycle, are going to have fertilized eggs. They're going to lay those eggs on the fruit. The fruit is now going to provide a nutrient source. And it's not that the maggots just eat the fruit and exist on top of it, but in fact, the maggots, the larval forms, are going to burrow down into the fruit. Okay, so they're going to feed on the fruit and also are going to locate within that fruit structure. All right, as they are going through this process of feeding on the fruit, eventually the fruit is going to fall from the tree, as is the case with a lot of fruit and berries. And what that allows for then is the movement of the maggot into the soil, and that's going to be where the pupal form is going to be found. So you go through pupation in the ground, and then ultimately, as you undergo metamorphosis, you will then emerge from the ground as an adult fly. So the flies, after pupation, are going to come out of the ground. You would imagine that if they were originally feeding on the fruit, they're going to be right in the vicinity of the plant or the shrub in this case where they were originally born or where the egg was laid. And so you're now going to have access to that fruit again as you become an adult and undergo your own reproductive cycle. Right, so that's the basic life cycle here of the maggot fly. All right, so that's all well and good, but of course you need some sort of selective pressure to be added to the story, right? So what you find is that maggot flies are actually parasitized. So you have to add in the evolutionary force of parasitism here to kind of build the case for what we're going to talk about later. All right, so who are the parasites? The parasites are not similar to like a human parasite where you would have like a single-celled protist or protozoan in your body internal. Instead, the parasites are a different type of arthropod. They are a breed of wasps that are going through their own life cycle. And just in the same way that the maggot flies use the fruit of the tree as a nutrient source, the parasitic wasps will lay their eggs onto the maggots, and the larval form of the wasp will produce a toxin that's going to paralyze the maggot, and then the wasp larvae will be able to feed on the maggot fly larvae. Right, so same idea, you just find a nutrient source. It just so happens that the nutrient source here is the larvae of a different organism. So right off the bat, now you have an evolutionary force at play. You're being parasitized, and so you would want to be able to prevent against this parasitism. All right, so how is that gonna happen? All right. Let's return back to talking about the habitat. So the natural habitat for the maggot fly is the hawthorn shrub, and the fruit that it produces is very analogous to like a cranberry. That's about the scope of the size that we're talking about. So not very big. Now, approximately 400 years ago, what was introduced to North America were apples. So apples are not a natural food source or fruit from the continent. They were brought here from Europe, I believe, and domesticated here. We got very good growing conditions. Obviously, we produce a lot of apples in North America, but they are not an original fruit to the area. Actually, North America doesn't have very many fruits that are native to the continent. I think there's only like 2 or 3 of them that actually are. Cranberries are one of them. And Concord grapes are another one, and I want to say that there's one more, but I'm blanking on what it is. But certainly apples are not. They were introduced by settlers, and this goes back to about 400 years ago, right? So now enter into the story of the maggot fly an option, right? So now you have a different plant, a different fruit source, and now you have the ability to be able to utilize your traditional fruit source, or now you can utilize this newly introduced fruit source in the vicinity. All right, so what you find is that maggot flies, or at least certain varieties or subpopulations of maggot flies, started utilizing that newly introduced fruit. Okay, and just to show you that I'm not lying, here are some of the maggot flies hanging out on apples. So they were capable of actually utilizing that fruit as a nutrient source for their young. All right, so what's happening here? So now you have a population, and that population is beginning to bifurcate, right? So you have subpopulations that are now doing different things. Some of them are locating to one habitat, being the hawthorn shrub, the traditional location, and some are starting to now identify apple trees as a new habitat. And it took, or approximately 150 years ago, mid 1800s, that was the first documented infestation of maggot flies in apple trees, or in apple crops. And so you have to imagine that wasn't the time at which the shift happened from one source to another source. It probably predated that, maybe 50 years, 100 years. So by the time a human was able to identify an infestation, the maggot flies had to have been utilizing that nutrient source. previously. So we could say that the shift happened at least 150 years ago, but probably earlier than that. And what's happening here, I keep using the term shift. This is referred to as a host shift. So you're using one host organism, the plant, for its fruit, and you're shifting to a different host organism. And then that becomes the habitat in this case as well. All right, so you have variation now. And the question is this going to basically induce an overall speciation event, or is it not? All right, so let's try to focus in here on first the actual idea of shifting from one plant to another plant. So why would you do this? If you take a look at the fruit, you're going to find that the fruit, an apple, is going to be much, much larger than a hawthorn berry, which is analogous, like I said, to about, something like a cranberry. And so the volume, the amount of food, of nutrients, is going to be far more substantial when you take a look at an apple versus a berry. Okay, so that would certainly be one rationale as to why flies would begin utilizing the newly introduced apple trees. Now, the problem is when you take a look at the quality of the fruit, you're going to find that the traditional source is a little bit better for the flies. It will allow for the development of the maggots much more frequently than apples will. So apples provide less of a nutrient source, although there is more of it to go around. And when studies are done on the development of the two different varieties of flies, what you'll find is that the apple maggots survive approximately 1/2 of the time of a hawthorn maggot. So you get twice as much production of young if you use the traditional fruit source. So again, the question is, what would, from an evolutionary standpoint, what would be pushing the movement of some of the flies to one variety of fruit versus the other one? And you can't necessarily say that it's a better source of nutrients for your young. Okay, so the question still remains, why are we switching? And one other aspect was the parasites that we talked about, right? So if you recall, what I said is that the maggots not only feed on the fruit, but they also are going to burrow themselves down into it. And so when you have a larger fruit like an apple, you obviously then are going to be able to burrow further into it. And that's going to prevent the possibility of a wasp parasitizing one of the apple maggots. And so because apples are a larger fruit, you get a diminishment of this parasitism, right? So you burrow further down into it, you avoid any sort of wasp larvae from identifying the apple maggot, and so you decrease the amount of parasitism. Okay, so if you do similar studies in the wild, you see that apple maggots tend to be parasitized a little bit less than the hawthorn maggots. So what this is showing you is that there's an evolutionary trade-off for everything. So you are trying to mitigate the parasitism, but then the give on that is going to be the nutritional quality of the food and the development of the young that you are producing, right? So everything is kind of like a seesaw when it comes to evolution. Is having a detrimental outcome better in this case or in that case? And that ultimately is going to push and pull a population. And so oftentimes I describe this as being, or it comes across as being a thought process by organisms, but it typically never is. What it becomes is really just natural shifts and natural tendencies of an organism to do one thing or another thing. So behavioral patterns really change. It's not necessarily a thought process that unfolds. All right. So here's our buddy, the maggot fly, right? So what can we say? We know that they're acting differently now, right? So some flies are beginning to identify the traditional fruit source. Some are beginning to identify the new fruit source. And because of that, they are obviously beginning to from a behavioral standpoint, act differently. All right. If you take a look at those two groups, there is no, from a traditional evolutionary perspective, there is no real difference, right? Anatomically, structurally, they look the same. You wouldn't be able to know to identify one versus the other unless you actually pick them off of one plant or the other. Okay. More recently, we've been able to dig down into the genetics, into the molecular biology, and the differences can be seen certainly with the genetic profiles of the different flies. But what can we say about that? Well, I'm a Caucasian of European ancestry, and so I'm going to have a genetic profile. And if I compare that to somebody of African descent, they're going to have a slightly different genetic profile. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you are two different species. And certainly, I could have a baby with somebody of African descent, and we could have a perfectly fine baby who is capable of reproducing itself. And so genetic distinction doesn't always necessarily mean that you have different species, right? So you could have slightly different genetic profiles and still be capable of producing viable offspring. So this certainly has opened up a new level of evolutionary analysis by looking at molecular profiles and genetics. But that is not kind of the cornerstone to the whole situation. All right, so what can we start taking a look at here? Well, what really matters is producing young, right? So from an evolutionary perspective, what you need to be able to do is produce viable offspring. And so we could start asking the question now: are there any barriers? Like we talked about, conceptual barriers that would prohibit these groups of flies from being able to breed with one another, such that they actually begin to become different species. All right. So first is overall, you can divide speciation down into either isolated groups, geographically isolated groups, or groups that are capable of interacting. And so in this case, there is no physical separation between them. It's not like they, are separated by a big mountain range. They can interact with one another. So that, as far as the terminology that we used before, is referred to as sympatric speciation, right? So they can interact with one another. All right, now the flies themselves, right? So if we take a look at it from the concepts and the terms that we used before, the flies themselves are showing a preference, right? So when a group of apple flies are interacting, they tend to breed and interact with other apple flies, and then vice versa. So they have behavioral patterns that are beginning to unfold, within the groups. And obviously the habitats are different, right? So if you're hanging out in an apple tree, you're probably going to be interacting with other apple flies and vice versa. So there are some barriers that are being established, right? Such that you have something very analogous to humans, like what I just described. Somebody of European descent, somebody of African descent can still ultimately, quote unquote, hybridize and make a viable offspring. And you see the same thing with the flies. So they are capable of hybridizing. They do it at a very low rate, and they produce young that really have no issues. Right. So can we describe these as being different species? Well, they do show hybridization, so it would be hard so far to say that they are completely different species at this point.
All right, Professor, I had a question.
Yeah.
So if they spend their time in different fruits, right? Like one is in the apple, one is in the hawthorn. So how is there no geographic isolation? It's their habitats are completely different, right?
Right, but the location of those plants, there's nothing that prevents those plants from being in the same vicinity as one another. So it's not like the flies can't move away from the plant, right? So in the same geographical area, you can have many different species of plants growing, And so there is no technical physical barrier. It's not like they have to cross an ocean to be able to interact with one another. So
Okay.
just because you are utilizing a plant doesn't mean that two plants can't be right next to each other. I guess that's kind of
Okay, got it.
the idea.
All right, got it.
All right. So actually, speaking about the plants, so the plants actually are also a an organism, right? So it's a good segue for that. And the plants operate on their own typical annual cycle themselves, right? So independent of the flies. And the flies, by virtue of the fact that they are selecting one versus the other, then also have to deal with what the plant is doing. All right, so the plant comes into play here also. So the plant by itself, going through its own cycle, is also helping the idea conceptually of speciation for the flies that are utilizing the plant. All right. What you're going to find is that apples and hawthorn berries are going to fruit at different times during the year. And if you were to put this on a graph that shows you just kind of the breakdown of a year, what you're going to see is the fruiting of apples and hawthorn berries represented in the yellow and the green peaks, right? So you have fruit developing, or the peak of fruit developing at different points during the year. And if you'll notice that the flies that are going to utilize those fruits are developing at different times of year, they're peaking at different times of year, which would stand to reason, right? So if you are a fly that's undergoing mating and you have to lay your eggs, you want to be sure that the fruit is going to be available when you have to lay your egg. And so in advance of the fruit being available, the different races of flies are beginning to mate and then develop their eggs. Right. And so that's going to happen earlier in the year for the apple flies, and then a little bit later for the hawthorn flies. So what you now have because of the plants is another factor that gets overlaid on top of this, which is temporal isolation, right? So the timing of how mating would happen, or when mating would happen, now is going to be beginning to be tied to the plant at which you find that given type of fly, one versus the other. All right, so preferences are one thing, behaviors are one thing, but then also timing is going to play a part in helping to push one population one way and the other another way. So there's lots of kind of overlaid evolutionary perspectives to be able to identify, even when looking at something like this as simple as a fly. All right, so back to our original question, are they different species? And I would probably say at this point, not quite yet, right? So they clearly are capable of hybridizing. They produce viable and fertile young that can go off and produce other generations. So at this point, I don't think they've diverged far enough and become different enough to be able to say that they are different species. And that is built on the case, or the fact that there are no postzygotic barriers, right? So they produce offspring, and those offspring are just fine. So they're close enough genetically. And if you use the same terminology that we apply to people, races, then obviously, you could take two different races of the same organism and hybridize them, and you probably wouldn't have any difficulty in producing a young. All right, so maggot flies are an example, or presumed to be an example, of an organism or a population that is actually going through the process of speciation. And so if you were to take a snapshot of any animal, any organism that was bifurcating in the same type of process, at any point in time, you would be able to try to compartmentalize why that's happening and for what reasons would that be happening, right? So, if we were around, 6-7 million years ago, we might be able to say, okay, well, look at this common ancestor of humans and chimps, and look at how the population is separating and look at how this population is becoming that type of thing and this other population is becoming this type of thing. So you could see that unfold, and you could overlay the concepts of evolution on top of a population that is undergoing speciation, or presumed to be at least, right? And just like I said earlier, the terminology sometimes is certainly not an absolute type of terminology, because even when you make different species, oftentimes you could find that different species can breed with one another and possibly have fertile offspring. So everything is kind of a little bit gray when it comes to evolution. But there are some overarching concepts that can be applied and are seen when you look at different examples like this. All right, so that's one natural example of speciation. And the other thing that I wanted to do was talk about something that was not so much a natural situation, but one that is referred to more from an artificial standpoint. Not to say that the origin wasn't natural, but certainly what's happened since its origin has been artificial. All right, so we're going to shift gears here and talk about canids, otherwise known as dog-like organisms. And we know that dogs, certainly domesticated dogs, are very, very diverse, right? But the diversity is, not to be cliche again, the diversity is really only skin deep, right? So when you take a look at any type of dog, whether it be a Mastiff or a Great Dane, all the way down to the little toy poodles and pugs, or poodles are not toys, pugs and Chihuahuas, things like that. They're essentially all of the same organism. They technically have the ability to interbreed with one another. Whether that could happen naturally or not is a different story. So you're never going to get a Chihuahua to breed with a Great Dane. That's just mechanically never going to be able to occur. But humans can artificially breed those two together and get some sort of hybrid being created. Actually, I don't even think Chihuahuas can birth their own young, if I'm correct about that. I think those are a completely artificial type of dog because of the size of the head versus the female reproductive structure. I don't think Chihuahuas can birth their own young, but I might be wrong about that. I think I heard that somewhere. Anyway, so dogs, right? So what do we know about dogs? Okay, we know, if you walk all the way back, a couple of millennia, we know that dogs were domesticated from wolves, right? So they are not our contemporary wolves that we have around today, the extant types of gray wolves, but these were a different population of gray wolves that have since gone extinct, probably led down the path not only of domestic dogs, but then also our current modern gray wolves, which is to say that common ancestors don't always remain. Sometimes you can subdivide a population, become two different contemporary organisms, but not retain the ancestral form, which is what you see in this case. All right. So what do we know about dogs? When did this happen? We don't really know. So that's kind of up in the air. There's a lot of debate about dog domestication if you were to dig into it. So there's a range at which this most likely happened. So anywhere from about 15,000 years ago to about 30, 40,000 years ago is the approximate time frame, which is a pretty vast time frame to try to identify when one event unfolded. When a dog finally walked out, or a wolf walked out of the woods and was ultimately domesticated. Which brings us to the next question of how many times did this happen? And the answer to that is equally debated, which is unclear. So possibly one time, probably two times. It's not 100% sure. And it could be the case that certain varieties of dogs are representatives of one domestication event, and others have become a different type of domesticated variety of dogs.
But Professor, I got a question.
Yep.
When you're saying like how many times, and then like it's once or maybe twice, like what are we actually talking about that happened? Domestication, right?
Yeah, domestication. Mm-hmm.
So how can that be classified as like once or twice? Wouldn't that happen like a lot of times to create like a whole population of dogs?
No, not
Or is that
necessarily.
domestication is just like the process, I guess?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So basically the origin of a species can be a large population, or it can be a relatively small population that then extends out and becomes a larger group of organisms. So I mean, take humans for example, right? So humans at one point numbered only about maybe 3,000 organisms, and we're on the verge of extinction ourselves. And from that point in time till now, we have exploded into a very, very large population, right? So that's what I mean. You could have a very, very small group of organisms that come about at one point in time, and then can radiate out over time into a much, much larger population that could then ultimately subdivide also.
Okay.
So how many times in the past were wolves domesticated into dogs? The idea, genetic idea, right? So a lot of this is based on the genetic backgrounds of contemporary dogs. The thought process is that it happened. Obviously, it had to have happened at least one time, but there's the possibility from a genetic standpoint that it happened in two different populations that have now since intermingled and become one overall group of organisms that we consider to be dogs.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. The where part of this is a little less ambiguous. So it is, basically understood that the populations of wolves came from the location of the Eurasian area, right? So the two continents. So possibly the Europe side, possibly the Asia side, meaning somewhere in Siberia. The actual location where it happened is not quite clear, but that general area is going to be the proper area where the event unfolded, or the multiple events unfolded. All right, so what have I basically told you here? I've basically told you nothing, and that's because, like I said, the domestication of dogs is kind of a debated type of process. But what we can agree on, or what most people will agree on, is that dogs certainly extend from a population of wolves, and our contemporary species is one unified species, meaning that you could take any variety of dog and breed it with any other variety of dog, whether that be natural or artificial. All right, so when you take a look at the continuity of organism, right? So a wolf becoming a dog, you should be able to see some hallmarks, some keys to say, okay, well, I could see the continuity. Just like if you were to put, next to each other, a chimp and a human, you could see some continuity, right? So there's structural, anatomical similarity between the two. Okay. Now the question is, did humans actually create this situation? Was it the fact that these ancestral humans really created dogs by selecting those wolves that would become dogs, or did this happen just by chance? Humans happened to be in the right area at the right point in time to be, associated with an evolutionary process that was unfolding anyway. So that is a question. And like I said, if you look at wolves versus dogs, you're going to see some continuity. All right, so if you take something like a husky or a Samoyed, so those types of dogs show a lot of continuity with wolves, right? So from a standpoint of features, you're going to see some very, very stark similarities. All right, but now obviously not every dog looks like a husky, right? And so you're certainly going to see some differences, right? So sometimes the looks of a dog can be deceiving, and you can lose those kind of more ancestral types of features. All right. So from a standpoint of traditional evolution, you might say, well, I'm going to look at this dog here, or like a Shih Tzu or a Chihuahua or a Pug, and I would say that this has to be very, very divergent from a wolf because it looks nothing like a wolf. Okay, but that's where molecular data comes into play. And from the genetic standpoint, we know that all dogs basically are, essentially the same genetic profile with just minor differences, and those minor differences play themselves out to produce these phenotypes that we see as being quote unquote drastically different, but really they're not. All right, so given that, and taking a look at one dog versus the wolf here, can you come up with any traits that you see not represented in wolves that are now represented in most dog breeds? So how do you know you're looking at a dog and not a wolf? I mean, just looking at the picture, do you see any differences?
I mean, like size, like dogs generally now are like they have a lot shorter legs.
All right. I mean, size could be one thing, right? But I mean, there are Great Danes that are larger than wolves. There are Mastiffs that are bigger than wolves. So sometimes size, from a genetic standpoint, can be equally played around with, just like some of the other features might be. So any other features that you could identify? I mean, this shouldn't be too hard. I think everybody's seen a dog before, and I'm showing you a picture of one.
Their ears are like more floppy.
Floppy ears, yeah. Never saw a wolf with floppy ears, right? Okay, so floppy ears would be a very, very good key feature of domesticated dogs, right? So there have to be some features that are going to be common to dogs that you don't see reflected in wolves. So anything else?
Their tails.
Tails, curly tails.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. So curly tails, floppy ears. You might also notice that their muzzle size is reduced, right? So a wolf has a more kind of prominent muzzle, where in certain types of dogs, you get this kind of reduced muzzle length. The teeth are a little bit underdeveloped when compared to wolves, right? So there's a lot of key features that would identify dogs as being dogs versus the more ancestral form of wolf, right? So certainly the behavioral characteristic of being tame. So obviously you can't be around a human if you're going to also be a predator of a human, right? Like a wolf could be. So being tame, like we said, floppy ears, curly tails, things like that. Coat coloration. So modeling is a term that gets applied to patchy coloration, right? So if you think about something like a border collie or like a Dalmatian even, right? So you see kind of like patchy colors. So that's also unique to dogs, and you don't see that type of patchy coloration in wolves, right? They tend to be more of a like a uniform coloration. All right, so there are some characteristics, some keys that basically identify a dog as its own species.
Hey, Professor.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, the wolf that we're talking about, that the dogs descended from, that species is extinct, but there are still other species of wolves that exist.
Right. So contemporary gray wolves are not the original ancestral organism that led to dogs. There were other groups of wolves that have since died out. And like I said, probably that original population most likely subdivided and led down the path of becoming modern wolves, modern gray wolves, as well as leading down the path of becoming modern dogs with a little bit of help from people.
Okay.
All right. So speaking of people helping the process along, so let's just take a quick look at it is a very, very pared down phylogeny of groups of dogs. So if you look at these phylogenetically, we've been honing in on our domesticated dog, which is the top of the phylogenetic tree here. Okay, there's our friend the husky, and we just made a case, and there is a lot of case to be made for dogs, domestic dogs, really being mostly related to wolves. Interestingly, somebody in the last class told me, I didn't fact check it, but he had said that the Shih Tzu is from a molecular standpoint, DNA standpoint, is the most closely related genetic dog to a wolf, which is striking, but also might be able to illustrate the point that the changes that you see are really only superficial, right? So that from a molecular and genetic standpoint, dogs, no matter how diverse and different they look, actually are very, very closely related to wolves. So I gotta go back and fact check that one. Okay, so these are the two populations. Now, in the canid family, right, there are other groups of dogs. If you look on the continent of Africa, there are other types of dogs like jackals, right? So these are canids as well. And if you look in other areas of the world, again, in certainly North America and in Europe and Asia, you will find also other canids, which we call foxes. Okay, so there's lots of different varieties of an organism once you start looking at a phylogeny like this. And the reason why I'm showing you this is to basically show that other organisms are related to dogs and wolves, and to lay the foundation for a question, which is, if humans, which we presume to be the case, if humans put their thumb on the scale, essentially, of creating a dog from an ancestral form of wolf, meaning that it really was our intervention that created or helped to create selectively the types of wolves that would ultimately become our modern day dogs, then the question is, could we do that again? Is that possible to be able to domesticate a canid? And so that's kind of the presumption. The presumption that we did this once is going to be the working foundation here. Okay, so can we do it again? If we did it once, the presumption being, can we do it one more time? Okay. Was it an evolutionary accident, like I had asked you before, or was it really the fact that humans created a species, and that species would not have existed had it not been for humans? Would there be dogs today if humans did not exist? So can we build a case for doing this again? And the answer comes very indirectly. The answer, to be a spoiler, would be yes. And the answer came indirectly from other breeding experiments. And so this is a breeding experiment that happened in the 1950s in Russia. And it happened at a time, so you have to put yourself in the 1950s. It was only about 20 years earlier that people even were able to identify that chromosomes existed within cells, that chromosomes were a thing, and that traits were tied to chromosomes. So even at this point, or just about at this point, there was experimentation going on that was trying to provide evidence as to whether the material of inheritance of those chromosomes, DNA versus protein, which one was actually specifying the passage of traits from one generation to the next. So the field of genetics at this time was very much a black box, and really cellular biology was only in its infancy at this point. So you have to understand that breeding experiments were still being done and viewed in a very traditional type of sense, where you look at traits and that you try to pass those traits off from one generation to the next, without a real working understanding about the molecular mechanisms behind it. All right. So for a long period of time in Russia and also in other areas close to that, so Europe and Russia and China, for a long period of time, what you found is that the very rich, wealthy, noble classes of those areas would hunt, not themselves, or would utilize the pelts of silver foxes. And silver foxes are a very rare form of red foxes. So they actually are red foxes, but they are a melanistic form. And so instead of having kind of like a brownish red color, they have kind of a silver type of pelt coloration, which is basically just a recessive gene. And so in a very infrequent or very infrequently, you're going to find just silver foxes pop up naturally. Now, the problem is that silver foxes don't readily breed with other silver foxes, right? So there is no drive to have a silver form find another recessive phenotype silver fox and breed with it to make only silver foxes. More frequently, silver foxes would just breed with other red foxes, and so even in a single litter, you could get litter mates that are both silver and red. And there's really no drive naturally to make one color or another color. All right, so here's what the silver foxes look like if you see them in their natural setting, and so very, very kind of stark difference, phenotypic difference from what you would see in a natural red fox. And of course, over kind of the human historical time frame, the pelts of these foxes then became sought after for making clothing for, like I said, the rich and the noble classes of those areas. All right. So by the time you get into the 1900s, you're a little bit more capable of actually breeding these organisms, capturing them, breeding them, and trying to produce more and more fur to make more and more clothing for more and more people who want it. And so that's the lens by which the experiment unfolded, right? So it had really nothing to do with answering a genetic question or answering an evolutionary question. The whole foundation was basically just one of a monetary outcome, being able to make enough clothing to provide to very rich, wealthy people. All right. What do we know about foxes? We know that foxes do not like people. They are a wild animal. They don't like being captive, and they are not going to be very, very nice to their captors. So there is a very, very aggressive stance that they take when in captivity. And so if you approach a fox that is in captivity, it's going to be very aggressive towards somebody coming near it. And so you would imagine that if your job in this in this breeding facility was basically to pick one fox and another fox and then put them together so that you could breed them, that might obviously carry with it some degree of risk, because these things didn't like to obviously be handled or to be moved around. All right, so the Russian government, bankrolling all of this, needs to figure out how it can make more pelts. And so they brought in a geneticist at the time, a guy that you probably have never heard of before. His name is Dmitry Belayev, and he was brought in by the Russian government, and he was basically given the task of figuring out what mechanism would be best to get an increase in breeding success, right? From a genetic standpoint. Like I said, genetics was really in its infancy here. So you're bringing in somebody who might know a little bit something different from a cellular perspective about how to approach this breeding project that was underway. All right. So he said, well, maybe what we could do is, instead of just selecting purely on the basis of coat coloration, maybe it would be a better idea to start breeding on the basis of temperament, right? So if I take foxes that are a little less aggressive, maybe I can breed a little bit more effectively. And so that was exactly his approach. And his roll of the dice was a presumption that behavioral characteristics were in fact genetically predetermined. And that seems very simple now, standing here in 2021. But if you put yourself in 1950, 55, whatever, that concept is relatively revolutionary, right? Because there's no understanding that behavioral characteristics were in fact predetermined or could even be predetermined by the cellular basis of an organism or the genetic basis of an organism. But he came along and said, well, you know what? I think that probably has something to do with inheritance. And so why don't we just try to pick very, very tame animals and see what happens? And within a very, very short period of time, about 10 years, what became of this breeding project and the organisms, the foxes that were being generated, what you saw is a pretty dramatic shift in the population. So what was that? What was that shift? What did it look like? Okay, first off, obviously, if you're selecting very tame animals, what you found is that the foxes started becoming very tame, very friendly, very playful with the people who were breeding them, right? So they now began interacting with their captors, with the humans. They also started vocalizing, which foxes generally never do, right? And this is very analogous to dogs barking, right? So you make vocalizations to the captors in this case, or to the humans, and that gives a secondary level of interaction. Actually, even more than that, some of them began responding to their names too. So there was a lot of give and take back and forth between the humans that were doing this and the developing foxes. Okay, what else happened? The coat coloration started to change, right? Very, very similar to what you see in dogs, you started to see in these foxes. You started getting these kind of patchwork colorations of different colors, and then white patches within the foxes. And lo and behold, you started getting floppy ears. Okay, very similar to what you see in dogs. So all of this was basically not expected, right? What was unfolding was a breeding experiment that was asking the question, how can I make this animal more and more and more tame, less aggressive towards people? And by doing that, all of a sudden, what was beginning to materialize were some of these characteristics that are reflected in domesticated organisms, specifically in dogs. Now, if you take some of these aspects, think about the coat coloration, right? You can see that reflected, that same idea reflected in other types of domesticated organisms. So the one that comes to mind is a Holstein cow, right? So the black and white cows. Those are completely manufactured by people, right? So those are not naturally occurring organisms, and they are very domesticated. And what do you see unfold in those is the same process, right? They begin taking on this kind of patchwork coloration. You see white patches of fur or hair in horses, right? Horses are domesticated. You could see it unfold in pigs and hogs and things like that. Dogs obviously are a good representation of this, right? So the idea that you could breed for a behavioral trait, and now you see all of the secondary phenotypic traits changing, now opens up the question as to why that is the case, right? So why do you get these changes? And why are they the same changes? All right, so let's try to parse out from a cellular perspective why you get some of these changes. Okay, so we know that we know now that behavioral traits are actually genetically tied, right? So it's not just that a behavior is produced from the environment interacting with an organism or the organism interacting in its environment, but you do have some genetic basis for how an organism is going to behave. All right, when you breed for something that's tame, more often than not, you are going to start to see the depigmentation of that organism. And the question is why? All right, so there's two kind of lines of evidence that you can use to answer the question as to why. Okay, number one is the fact that aggressiveness or tameness is really built on the fight or flight response. And so, having gone over the hormone chapter earlier in the semester, what do we know that the hormone is that's tied to the fight or flight response? Anybody remember?
Like epinephrine.
Epinephrine, norepinephrine.
Right. Okay. So adrenaline, basically. So as you pick for a tamer animal, what you are doing is you're selecting for animals that have less epinephrine, right? Less adrenaline. And I heard somebody say norepinephrine. So what we also know about epinephrine is that it is a single molecule, but it's a class. It's part of a class of molecules, and that class is referred to as the catecholamines. Okay, we took a lot of time talking about epinephrine and dopamine and norepinephrine, but associated with that is another chemical, or another molecule known as melanin. And these are all created in the same biochemical pathway. It's just at what point do you stop in that pathway, which will give you one form of the catecholamine or another form. And they're all derived biochemically from the same original precursor molecule, which is tyrosine. Right. So you can make the case then that one reason why you get this secondary feature of losing pigmentation is because you are basically selecting for a reduced biochemical processing of tyrosine. So that's one answer to the question why depigmentation happens when you select for tameness or lack of aggression. All right, so that's one piece of the puzzle. Second piece of the puzzle has to do with a developmental process that unfolds that, again, we talked about earlier in the semester. Okay, if you remember, we discussed the process of gastrulation, and as you go through gastrulation, one of the very first events that's going to unfold in early embryonic development is going to be the development of something known as the neural tube. And you take an area of the blastula and you basically create this tube structure from it. And what I didn't tell you then is that there are associated regions of the neural tube that basically from the blastula sit on the sides of it, like you can see color-coded here in the green, which make up an area known as the neural crest. The neural crest is essentially a different population of cells that are migratory cells, and that's what you see down at the bottom of the figure. And those cells, as you go through the process of gastrulation, those cells are going to move away from this neural tube that's newly created. And those cells are basically going to be seeding the beginnings of other structures and other tissue types within the developing embryo. And if you take a look at that as far as the different types of tissues that are going to be created, it would look something like this. So this picture is basically showing you the same thing, the neural tube being created, the migratory cells from the neural crest that are going to move away from that area. And the figure is now showing you what those cells become. What is it seeding? What different types of tissues will be generated from those cells? Okay, so if you take a look right off the bat at the left-hand side of the figure, you can see that one of the tissue types that's made is cells that are known as melanocytes, right? Melanocytes make melanin, and so the impact of this whole process will, or impacting this process will be in some way, shape, or form tied to melanocytes producing pigment. And if you look across the different tissue types, you can see that neurons are impacted, meaning that the nervous system development will be impacted. Moving along the bottom, you can see that osteoblasts and clasts are impacted, meaning that bone structure will be impacted. And then off to the right-hand side, chondrocytes. Chondrocytes are the cells that make cartilage. So the cartilage development is going to be impacted as well. So if you take a look at the neural crest and see all of the different tissue types and structures that will be developed from that structure, that by itself ties all of these features together. So much so that if you overlay this onto a different figure, like you see here, which is a dog, you can begin to parse out how all of the physical changes that you see in the dog are really tied to this neural crest quote unquote issue, problem, meaning that you have a lack of development in the neural crest. So if the blue cord there on the back of the dog is the embryonic neural crest, what you could see is that neural crest is going to have a role to play in the development of the adrenal glands. Okay, well, we know that adrenal glands are going to be making epinephrine, and we have less epinephrine, so a tamer animal is going to result from that. Up towards the head of the organism, you can see of the dog, you can see the cartilage is going to be impacted. That's where the floppy ears come from. The bone structure is going to be impacted. So that's where you get a reduction in the teeth size. You get a reduction in the snout. You get a reduction in the brain development, right? So the brain size is going to be impacted just from what we'd said, that the nervous system is part of the migratory cells coming from the neural crest. The pigmentation that we talked about, your melanocytes are being affected, so your pigmentation is going to be affected. So stepping back from this, when somebody were to take an animal and say this animal is tame, the behavioral trait of being tame is actually built on a developmental issue, and that issue is a deficit in the functioning of the neural crest. And because of that one single trait, right, behavioral trait of being tame, and if you select for that, breeding generation after generation, what you're really doing is selecting for a neural crest deficit that impacts all of these other aspects of the organism, or the dog in this case. And if you tie all of these aspects together, because it actually is a deficit, in a developmental deficit, this is referred to as being a syndrome, and it's referred to as being domestication syndrome. Because every time you domesticate an animal based on the fact that that animal is quote unquote tame or not aggressive, all of these same characteristics precipitate from that one behavioral trait. And so the unifying theme here is that everything that you see play itself out physically really stems from the neural crest. And so ultimately what you're doing is selecting for a developmental issue in these animals. And no matter what animal that you're going to be picking out, whether that's a cow or a dog or a horse, you're going to get the same process basically unfolding because of that. All right, and so if we look at this in flowchart form, right, at the very top, we're selecting for tameness. This could be in any animal, a wolf or a fox in this case. But that tameness is really built on this deficit, this neural crest deficit. And as you exacerbate generation after generation that neural crest deficit, what the presumed end result is going to be is off to the left, where you get more and more and more of a tame organism, less fearful of people, more interactive. That's going to be the result of it. But if you look straight down in the flowchart here, notice all of those other features are also going to be impacted because of the neural crest deficit that's being selected for. So there are always byproducts to selective breeding. And even though you're selecting for one given trait, one gene, one trait, one aspect of an organism doesn't occur in a vacuum. It almost all the time is going to be tied to other aspects. of an animal. And so when you think about this in terms of selective breeding, right, what we can see is that humans have done this a number of different times in a number of domesticated animals. And what unfolds is always the same process. And now, from a cellular and developmental standpoint, we can begin to understand why you get all of these byproducts or these outcomes that aren't necessarily being selected for, that are always precipitating from the selection for a tame for a tame animal. Right. So, at the end of the day, we probably did, in fact, produce dogs by selective breeding, unknowingly doing the same thing. Where you probably had a group or a few very tame wolves that began interacting a little bit more with humans. And as those tame versions of the wolves began hanging out a little bit more frequently with humans, they began breeding with themselves, selecting tamer and tamer and tamer forms of wolves that ultimately then became what we would be considered different species now, dogs. And indirectly, that was all identified by the fox breeding experiments of the 1950s. So I think it's important to see how the cellular environment ties together with the evolutionary process, and how humans can sometimes play a role and sometimes don't play a role, like we saw with the flies. So there's a lot of different layers to evolution, and you can look at it from a lot of different standpoints. And hopefully you can see that some of the concepts that we learned about, feed into different tangible real world examples when they're introduced to you. So that is all we have for today. We have one more session to get through, so I'll pick up with some of the slides next time when we meet again on Thursday. Okay. All right. So you guys are free to go at this point.
All right. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.